Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess, publisher of Lawfare. This week, former CIA analyst Yaya Fanusie on financial intelligence, fact and fiction.
This designated terrorist group that was posting on Twitter asking their followers to send them Bitcoin. I mean, a light bulb just went off in my head. I said, wait a second, I can analyze terrorist financing directly. I don't have to, go to the bank and get a subpoena and look at transactions. This is all public. This innovation of crypto, it now also exists for state actors to find an alternative way to transfer money outside of the influence of U.S. sanctions power. China right now is in the early stages of its own new central bank digital currency, and it's trying to encourage the rest of the world to sort of learn from its model. I don't think we're even in the ball game there yet.
Yaya Fanusie, thanks for coming on Chatter and talking to me today.
Great to be with you, David. Thank you.
I've been looking forward to this. We'll talk a bit about our career paths and their intersection. I want to say going back about 15 years, which makes me feel old because it feels like it was yesterday. But I've wanted to have you on because you have crossed the divide that many people seek to and don't quite make it, of doing some really important work in national security, increasingly in your realm, doing financial intelligence and cryptocurrency analysis, but also some truly creative artwork. And I want to talk about both of those as we go on. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about young Yaya. How did you ever get into government in the first place? And was that like path dependency? Like looking back, you knew that would happen, or were there alternate futures that could have turned out very differently?
So many alternate futures. I don't think anyone would have guessed, pre 2000 that I would be where I am today, talking with you about my career formerly as a CIA analyst, because I had a circuitous route. I mean, I don't know how far back I should go, but in terms of my professional route, I wasn't focused on government work until I had the experience teaching. So I had a master's, I had an undergraduate degree in economics, a master's in international affairs with a focus on international finance. So on paper, not so surprising. But I think, I was one of those people, I practically went straight to grad school. I didn't have a whole lot of experience. So when I graduated, I actually was not interested in foreign policy. I actually was interested in education for a variety of reasons. So again, a very circuitous route. And my first job was in DC. I worked for DC government in the budget office, working for the school system. So I was a budget analyst overseeing the finances of various school offices and schools, and got an opportunity.
How did you get that job? Because I thought, maybe I have this memory wrong, but I thought you told me you grew up in California.
Yeah. So, born and raised a Californian. I grew up and lived all of my life there until graduate school. So, or actually until I graduated from UC Berkeley, right? So again, Californian, born and raised. I thought I wanted to go to the East Coast for grad school. Ended up going to Berkeley, had the time of my life. And that ties into what we'll talk about later, because one of my best memories from undergrad was I had a radio show. Volunteer radio show, college radio, Berkeley.
So fun.
So much fun. Time of my life. My own show in the basement of KALX. And so I had this creative side, this creative streak that was with me all throughout school. Now, I go to West Africa for the Fulbright after I graduate. And then I had already accepted a master's at Columbia in New York. So I deferred to do the Fulbright, spent a year in Ghana, and then came back. And all of a sudden, I've been on the East Coast since the late 90s. And so after Columbia, I was looking for work, and I was in DC on my spring break, a month or two from graduating, and I actually was considering teaching. I think I felt sort of disenchanted with, my career path, and I was like, oh, I don't, I think I want to teach. And so I didn't teach right away. I was networking and happened to talk to someone who was hiring for a budget analyst position in the DC government, the DC public school system. And so that was my first job. And from there, I got an opportunity to teach at a charter school. I taught math at a public charter high school in DC. And this is not your typical story of the young teacher who comes and then against all odds, and then he loves it, and everything is great. It was the toughest job I ever had,
Oof.
working as you can imagine, right?
And I mean,
Um,
teaching at any level is a challenge, and different challenges at different levels that don't translate to person good at one level. I can't imagine having taught a graduate class that I could teach kindergarten or grade school.
yeah.
And similarly, I've known people who have taught things like special needs classes in elementary school who might feel that they couldn't teach at the college level. But what was it about teaching that like didn't click for you?
Well, as a teacher, you are always on. I think it's the stress level. I find myself I'm an introvert. I would say, people don't. Some people might not know that, but right, I need my time to to regroup, to recharge. And as a teacher, it's not just the teaching, right? Obviously, everyone talks about the lesson planning, but the whole day, you never have downtime. I mean, when the bell rings, you were out in the hall, you were trying to keep order, you were following up, you're, addressing whether it's fights or, and that was just very intense. And so, it was 3 years, but what happened for me was I went from thinking, hey, I think education may be my thing. I could see myself as a principal or assistant principal. Let me just get some teaching experience. And with a month in, it was clear to me that no, I don't think this is where I want to go. And so, although great experiences, right? Like everything in a career, mixed bag. I mean, there for 3 years, loved so much of it. I love teaching in a sense, right? But the whole job was not for me, and it took me 3 years to find a job to find a job that was suitable for me to leave teaching. I was young and I was married at the time, and actually had my son. We had our son during my first year teaching, so I couldn't just up and leave. And I was considering the State Department. I was thinking, you know what, I think maybe let me back into foreign policy. And I was having a conversation with a diplomat in residence who was at Howard University. My wife was there doing her PhD at the time, and he had just been visited by a CIA recruiter, someone from the Directorate of Intelligence, who was,
Aha.
visiting campuses and, dropping her card. And we were talking about jobs with a financial or economic focus in the government. And he said, think about Treasury, think about Commerce. And then he said, have you ever thought about the CIA? And I had never really had. I mean, if you want to sort of bring this bridge too, if I can bridge there was me growing up in California, going to Berkeley. The CIA was not on my radar. I mean, in terms of a place where I would work. I mean, for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that. But I had matured right since then, and when the question was posed, my first question was like, My first thought was, I hadn't really thought about that. I hadn't really thought about Intel. I don't know much about Intel. I did international affairs, but I didn't do security, and I got my degree, my master's, before 9/11. Right. And I often tell people the funny thing about going to this, SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs, graduating in 2000 was I don't remember the people that did security, who concentrated. Everyone was doing finance or maybe a regional concentration or economic development. The security concentration was such a niche thing pre 9/11. So I hadn't really studied Intel or anything like that. But it was talking to this recruiter who was from the DI, and she described to me what the life was like what the work was like for an intelligence analyst. And it sounded so, it sounded the way she described it, she said, this is like grad school, but better. It's more real. It's very intriguing. It's intellectually stimulating.
And you get paid.
And you get paid, right? Win-win. And so I was very open to it. So I decided to look into the intel world, look into the CIA, learn more about the CIA. Right? I've said that the CIA, as you know, right, the public perception is a mix of misinformation, myth, and Hollywood, and very little. There are a few nuggets of fact that may be there, but most people don't understand it. So that was the path, and I went, interviewed, and eventually was hired as an economic analyst, and then later got into the counterterrorism world.
So, what did your family and friends from back in California think about this? Surely you told some of them that you were going to be working in intelligence. How did they react?
There was nothing negative, which is, I think, what one might think. I think the people who knew me well were, felt that, oh wow, this makes sense, yeah, so there wasn't, obviously, because I had to have people, I had all these my references, family references, and friends. So yeah, no one who knew me, had any misgivings or thought that this wouldn't be a good fit. But I think maybe from afar, right? Someone's, oh, this guy from Berkeley, what is he doing? Especially maybe the high school persona of me, right? Which, but people who knew me well, I don't think were surprised, and I think people knew that, wow, if Yaya's doing this must be like something very interesting, something very positive to this.
Sure. So you said you started out. Talk about the analytic job that you had. Obviously, not the classified reports you saw.
Yeah.
Too many classified reports floating around these days. But talk about the actual job you had and what it was like and how that carried through your career, even as you applied it to different types of analysis and different domains.
So I was hired as an economic analyst, as I said, over a specific set of countries in Africa. So I was hired for the Africa issue group. Right. So the key area of focus for me at that time was corruption and energy issues. So I dealt with a country that dealt with oil, that was an oil supplier, and obviously corruption is a pretty prominent issue when it comes to many African countries. So an economic analyst covering Africa, especially at that time, you're dealing probably more. I mean, it's really sort of political economy, right? It wasn't outside of some issues where I covered where maybe we looked a little bit at capital markets at some of the surrounding countries. It was really sort of looking at politics, corruption, and the like. And so that was
You're not
my
doing like hardcore econometric modeling and advanced statistics. It really is looking at the intersection of the economics with the political structure.
Exactly, right. I mean, you may touch on some of that. You may work with other parts of the agency, right? Especially on the oil side, right? I mean, there were folks who definitely were experts in energy and oil economic issues, but here's what you do. I think when you join the agency, especially if you don't have experience in government. This was my first federal government job. The first thing you do is just learn what it is to be an intelligence analyst, right? You have to learn the trade craft. You go through the training that all of us go through to learn how to do the writing, how to do the briefing, and so that's what I focused on. I'd say for my first year and a half, right? Just understanding, well, what does it mean? It was later when I became a counterterrorism analyst. I went over to the National Counterterrorism Center, volunteered to go. And there's
You brush over that like it doesn't need explanation, but people don't know the backstory at the time of
yeah.
the rise of, well, first TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, which evolved into the National Counterterrorism Center. And here's a whole new entity being created to do something that the Counterterrorist Center at CIA thought it was already doing to some extent. And other elements of the government, everybody's asked to basically contribute and help build this organization. Describe that dynamic and in particular, why you were happy to go there.
Well, it was again, a bit of a circuitous route because I'm there my first year just learning about the agency, learning about what's this business of intelligence and where do I fit. And honestly, I was pretty happy with my role. I mean, you know, I remember some of my first report that I wrote, and I got feedback the next day from the briefer. It wasn't the PDB; it was one of our sort of more mid-level, or not mid-level, but our more widely distributed products. And I got feedback the next morning saying, "Oh, the person read it with interest. This is a high-level person. They read it with interest, and they thought it was a good paper." So that was great. So I loved the work, but something happened during the course of my 4-month CAP training. I remember I arrived at the building where we had our training, and I walk into our classroom, and it happens to be July 7th, 2005, the date of the 7/7 bombing. And so here I'm. So I'm in training. So I'm not at my desk, right? So I'm going to be away from my desk, and I see what's happening on the news. And of course, information comes in about what was what, and so this. Many people had, I guess, a 9/11 experience where it's like 9/11 sort of, maybe made them guide their careers in a certain way. Of course, I wasn't in government in 9/11, but for me, 2005 was very influential because of who did it. Because the 2005, 7/7 was perpetrated by 4 British Muslims. One was a convert, 3 were, sort of
Right,
born and
right.
raised British. And so, something I didn't mention, just on a personal note, I'm a Muslim convert. I converted to Islam in my college years. So these weren't like the 19 hijackers. These were Western Muslims, young. And so in a sense, I said to myself, this is an identity that I feel I have insight into, that I understand. I have family in London on my father's side. I have family there. One relative who actually was on the underground that morning, but thankfully was not harmed. And so I'm thinking about it sort of is hitting home, the threat, the risk, and then the perpetrators. And then I started to think about, wow, maybe this is an area that I should get involved in, even though I never studied terrorism. And there were people at CTC, within the CIA, who I knew, who had mentioned to me, "Oh, yeah, maybe you should get into counterterrorism." And it was at that moment that I started to think, you know what, maybe I should. And asking people around, talking to different people who would become mentors. Eventually, someone that who was high up in NCTC's DI, basically, I talked to him, and then he sort of recruited me or had me come over to NCTC.
So NCTC really is a melting pot of sorts at that point. You had people from at least almost in every group then, a half dozen or more different agencies and departments. What was that like? Because you came with some experience. You're not patting your own back here, but you were a good analyst back at CIA, and within a few years of starting, you had actually briefed President Bush in person. And suddenly here you are going to NCTC with some people who also had rich experience elsewhere, but many of whom did not, because some agencies and departments simply sent bodies, including brand new people, because they had to fulfill a quota for this new organization. What was that like?
Yeah, and this is where, I mean, I will have to, and I'll be very blunt, right? Because sometimes there are all these interagency dynamics that often don't see the light of day in publicly. A lot of people didn't, especially at this time, right? This is like 2006, 2007. A lot of people at the agency, didn't have a high opinion of NCTC, if I can say, because of what you said, right? I mean, honestly, look, the CIA, DI, especially at the time, right? The creme de la creme, right? In terms of analytic tradecraft, the training, the writing, right? So there's a certain level of performance there. And obviously NCTC, a new organization where they're just pulling from everywhere. And you always have this issue where every agency thinks the other agency is redundant, and interagency, there's that. But I will say this about NCTC. I mean, NCTC, I think went through. There was a learning curve. It did sort of transform form from those early years where, yeah, maybe there was uneven quality, perhaps. And as time went on, they started to really professionalize the analytic core, if I could use that term there, right, with more training, giving them the same training that CIA analysts got. I think I saw that started to change. But my personal experience was very good at NCTC, and one of the reasons why is that you know there was an interagency culture. Now, obviously, every agency has its culture. The thing about NCTC that I enjoyed was that literally on my left was an FBI analyst, and then, but in front of me was a DI. The cube in front of me was someone from DIA. You know. NSA, like on our team, like all of us, State Department nearby, we're all working together, and so I really enjoy. To me, I felt that the culture was a little bit more fresh, and then because of the issue, so I was in a group that focused on Al Qaeda, and for a while, most of my time I was looking at homeland plotting. I looked, I dealt a lot with the issue of radicalization and how that was impacting particularly Sunni extremist groups that were part of Al Qaeda or affiliated by Al Qaeda, inspired by Al Qaeda, and so here I am in this situation doing the great work of intelligence, but also sort of tapping into, I think, my cultural expertise, my understanding, when jihadist groups were when they were messaging, right? Obviously they would make references that I think I understood from my own sort of faith understanding of scripture, understanding of Islamic history, being able to understand what the nuance was there, what they were trying to say, I think was helpful in understanding what was before us, in the CT fight.
Yeah, and I will say, it's around this time that I first met you in person. I'd heard of your work before then. I was gone from government by then, but I was still teaching some training classes, coming back on contract. And I won't go into details, but I will recall a training class that you were in, and it was pretty clear that you did not need to be in that class. It wasn't quite an intro class, but it was close to it. And yet your attitude was exactly the attitude any professional would want in that environment, because you didn't let it show. You didn't roll your eyes, at least not that I could see. In fact, you were one of those helpful people in the room, kind of helping to bring others along. And I appreciated it then, and I still appreciate it now. NCTC was such a different animal in so many ways. How long roughly were you there, and why did you leave?
So, looking back, because sometimes the years blur together. My agency was only about 7 years, and so about five of that was at NCTC. Why did I leave is a bit of a mixed bag. Well, or no, why I left isn't a mixed bag, but my experience was a mixed bag. I tell people that my time at the agency was the highlight of my life. I mean, you mentioned, right? I had the opportunity to brief President Bush once when he came over to NCTC. Great experiences. My time in Afghanistan as well. Um, but there were some challenges, and without going into too much detail, I will say, because this will come up, I'm sure, when we talk a little bit about some of the creative work that I've been doing.
Hmm.
There was some awkwardness around the. Let me just be blunt. I had a tough clearance process. I had a
Mm.
really tough. I mean, a lot of headaches, a lot of I don't. I mean, it's the CIA, so I won't say. I mean, there's always going to be, for good reason, scrutiny. But I will say that process for me was very much a headache,
Yeah.
led to some things that really just left a bad taste in my mouth,
Hmm.
and so maybe I'll just leave it there. But I mean,
Yeah. We'll pick up on it when it comes to Yaya, the actual person, putting a little bit of himself into a fictional character, which is your recent project. But it does speak to the point that a lot of people know that to get into the intelligence community, and in particular the CIA, you have an extensive background check and research process into you and all of that. And that's intrusive, and people get through it or they don't. But it's not over. People don't often think about the reinvestigation as much. And I know in your case, the reinvestigation was even more difficult, if you will, and just uncomfortable. But it's important, I think, as you said earlier, that you still recognize that overall it was a great experience working there.
Yes, great experience, and I think there was some awkwardness to my role that sort of came up during some of that reinvestigation process. I mean, I'm not trying to say I was so unique. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. Right. So here I am to put it out on the table. Here I am. Call it what you want to say, an observant, practicing Muslim, which there are many in in the intel community,
Oh
right? So
yeah.
I don't want to make
Yep.
it seem like, oh wow, there
That is
there
not a
aren't many.
rarity.
It's not
Right.
a rarity at all. Um, so in my situation, where I you know have that identity, and very someone who is part of the Muslim community, right? I'm part of the Muslim American community. I've traveled overseas, right? And so there were just questions that were raised as during my time that, again, made that reinvestigation process, I think, harder than it should have been. And yeah, it made it very difficult at times. And so that was the side. It was so funny because I remember telling my wife, um, there was a time when over at NCTC, I remember saying out loud, I love this stuff. I'd do this this job for free. I mean, it was so compelling, so intriguing, the work. But there was that side that I think most of us hate, which is you're on the hot seat and you get put through a lot. And for me, that just was too much, and
Yeah.
I ended up not continuing.
So what did you decide to do? You've been involved in a lot of things, and not to talk about your current project, which is amazing, and I do want to spend a lot of time on. But
Yeah.
you've done a variety of things since then. So describe those, and then I do want to talk about some of the substance of the work as well. After you describe how you moved from the economic analysis through the counterterrorism to really focusing on some of the financial transactional work.
Yeah. Well, so it's really interesting because my work as an analyst, it's funny how everything sort of opened the door for the next thing, because even though I had my exit from the agency, and part of me felt like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm not going to do this sort of work long term. I'll do something different. But you know um what I did right out was, I worked with a consulting firm, and our project was financial asset recovery. So my first job was working with a team of former government people. Some of us were former CIA, some of us were former IRS, criminal investigators, State Department, and we were mandated to look at kleptocratic asset recovery, basically recovering assets that were stolen due to corruption and recovering those assets for the rightful people, for the government, or for the new government, for the new people in one of the Arab Spring nations, right? Where there was a dictator who had been kicked out. And so what was interesting was, so here I am. So I was the lead analyst for this project. So our task was to find these assets and figure out how to get them back to the people. But we had no badge. We had no badges. We had no subpoena power. We were private citizens with a private consulting firm. So we had to build really an open source based methodology for researching, identifying the assets, researching, and also sort of doing the link analysis, really, right? Of who would be connected to the previous regime. What are their associations? What is their property? What assets do they have? And really sort of mapping that out, mapping out a network. And this was all, again, open source. And then figuring out what are the tools? What's analytic software we could use? What's off the shelf stuff that we can use for different types of databases, et cetera. And that sort of, I actually love that work. I mean, it was a short-lived project. It only lasted a couple of years, but that's when I got my first taste of really this open source intelligence, more so than what I had done at the agency. Although, of course, there's open source intel at the agency as well. So that was my first job, and that was my foray, I guess, into illicit finance research. Not just the corruption stuff I had done before, but really money laundering, looking at money laundering and the like. And that's what sort of set me on sort of the path that I'm on today with some of my research.
So there's certainly, going back decades in intelligence, there's work on illicit finance, right? There's work on money movements, whether it's related to drug trafficking or terrorism or just governmental corruption. That's the kind of thing that you would have looked at occasionally as an economics analyst, and specifically illicit finance experts would have looked at. But you said something else in there that kind of takes it to a new level in the last 10, 15 years, which is the huge attention to cryptocurrencies. I really want to break down this field because for a lot of people in national security, I was one of those people who did security studies all through and wasn't focused on development and international economics as your colleagues were at Columbia. For me, I understand all of the words you use individually when you're talking about this stuff. I know what finance means. I know what illicit means. I think I even understand what cryptocurrency means. But once you start combining them all and you throw in some blockchain and some other terms, I kind of feel like I'm Denzel in Philadelphia when Andrew Beckett comes to him and Denzel, the lawyer, says, you're going to have to explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old. So help me out, talk a little bit about a fundamental understanding for anybody. This will go back to your experience as a teacher. So I'm putting you on the spot, but teach us about financial transactions and how the cryptocurrency in particular plays into that and makes things much more challenging for analysts at every level.
So I think I'll respond with my anecdote of how I got into crypto. But I'm actually going to say something which may go against what you said, because you said that this may make it more difficult for analysts. But actually, I'll explain how this is great for analysts. So looking at crypto. So fast forward a little bit from the consulting job. I joined a think tank. I joined, this is 2015, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which had stood up a center on sanctions and illicit finance. And again, remember how one thing leads to another, right? The consulting job sort of led to this, which was interesting. I felt like I was a bit of a fish out of water because, sanctions, illicit finance and sanctions also within the government is a very, very niche area, right? Folks at Treasury, I mean, that's a very, sanctions is a very niche subject, especially at this time, right? This is sort of during the heyday of the Iran sanctions. So it's growing as a policy issue, as a national security issue, but still very niche. And here I am in 2015, adapting to this new environment of being at a think tank, writing for the public, et cetera, doing research that's public. And I'm looking at what are the issues that are out there. And I heard about this thing called Bitcoin, which I knew very little about, in 2015. But I hear people are saying that, ISIS may be using Bitcoin and terrorists may use Bitcoin. And then the intel analyst in me is like, okay, well, let's see what the data says. Let's see what evidence there is out there. And in 2015, I never could confirm any of these assertions in the press that ISIS was going to be using Bitcoin until something happened in 2016. So 2016, I see a press report from somewhere in the Middle East, and it said that a designated terrorist group was conducting a terrorist or a Bitcoin crowdfunding campaign. And at first I'm like, oh, okay, well, what is this? It's probably just another press, just alarmism or whatever. And so I had two interns, and so I was about to go to lunch. I said, "Hey, can you all look at this while I go to lunch? Go check the go check the press and see if there's anything there. And and it's probably nothing, but we got to look into it." So I come back from lunch, and my interns, who were great, showed me they did a little bit more research. They found that this designated terrorist group that was in the Middle East, and a jihadist group. Technically, it was called the Mujahideen Shura Council. It was sort of a consortium of jihadist groups, and they had a long-time social media presence. And on their Twitter page was an infographic, and the infographic had a QR code, and it said Bitcoin. So they're posting on Twitter asking their followers to send them Bitcoin. So we scanned the QR code. Once we scanned it, it just opens up to a new website. And the website, it's blockchain.info. And basically what that is it is a browser that lets you see the different wallet addresses that are associated with Bitcoin software. So if you have Bitcoin, basically means you have an address and there's a digital asset in it. We won't get too much into the details, but just sort of hear me out here. So what happened was that when I saw that, we clicked on the QR code, which took us to their address. And now what the address shows is it shows you any transactions that go to that address. And it shows you how much Bitcoin is in there, or half a Bitcoin, or 0.0005 Bitcoin. You can see it.
Which is a huge advance over a lot of traditional accounts of cash, right? I mean, that's amazing.
A light bulb just went off in my head. I said, wait a second. I can analyze terrorist financing directly. I don't have to, go to the bank and get a subpoena and look at transactions. This is all public. Yeah. And the reason why it's public, David, you said like finance and crypto, all these different words. Sometimes we're sort of mixing words because it's not finance. Crypto is not really finance per se. Finance as we know it, finance is a banking thing, right? Banking infrastructure. It's money, and then you bring in cash, right? Which is put out by a government, right? Central bank money, fiat currency. Bitcoin and crypto is a tech invention. It is a computer software, so it's really something out of the tech world, even though we talk about it as digital finance or something financial. So that's why that's why it's a bit different. But because Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, because they're software and they're open source software, right? The idea is that these are transactions built on an open source ledger that anyone can see, anyone can tap into. So the analyst in me all of a sudden realized that, okay, so this is something to write about. This is actually something where we could learn, because now I can just simply every morning when I come to work, we're going to look at that address and we're going to see if there's if it goes up, if it goes down. And then, we wrote an article about that. So that was the beginning of me looking at cryptocurrencies, blockchain, call it digital assets, digital finance, but looking at this sort of evolution of money digitally as a national security issue. And that's what I've been focused on much of the past several years.
So help me explain this to my son, because my son heard about Bitcoin and basically asked me the fundamental question that I think a lot of people have, which is what is it based on? And I think it's because probably somewhere in school he heard that, the dollar, had, gold reserves behind it, or the full faith and credit of the United States, as it's stated on the currency. But Bitcoin has behind it other people valuing the Bitcoin, but there is no government backing the currency as it is. So explain how that works in terms of why people have faith in it as a currency.
Yeah, maybe the flip answer is it's not based on anything, quote unquote. I can say that, but the story doesn't stop there. It's based on the demand. It's based on supply and demand, or the market demand for something that is designated digitally within this ledger. So it basically means that since now I've got the software, and now the software has amounts of Bitcoin in different addresses. So if I can prove to someone, which you can because it's right there, if I can say, hey, I've got a designated amount of Bitcoin how much would people buy it from me for? There's potential market demand. Now maybe they're going to give you $100, maybe they're going to give you $10,000 or $20,000. That has varied over time. Now that there's a market, or for a while we've had a market for this digital asset and other digital assets. Now you can take this digital designation on the ledger and sell it for regular US money or fiat cash. So now there's this market. Now this is why you have speculation, you have volatility, because you can finally market this. You can finally sell this at an exchange. What's probably important to note is what did Bitcoin solve? Like, why is it even a thing?
Yeah,
right.
What gap is Bitcoin filling?
Exactly, and the gap goes to something known as the double spending problem. And
I
this
thought
is
you were going to go Dumbledore on me, and this was going to be a Harry Potter thing, which does not give us confidence in Bitcoin. But instead, what, the double spending?
The double spending problem.
Okay.
So the double spending problem is a basic problem of the internet and how the internet manages, or how data is transferred on the internet, right? So perfect example that we all know of is when you send a file on the internet, an email, a JPEG, etc. It's simply a copy, right? It's copied from your hard drive or your phone, your inbox, and it goes across cyberspace and someone else opens it, but you still have it in your inbox. That is how the internet works, but that doesn't work for value, for money, right? I can't have a copy of $100 and then send it to you. So even though the internet has been this great revolution for communicating data and information, it has never worked sufficiently for transferring value, transferring money. So when it came to transferring money, we always have had to use an intermediary to check your account, credit it and debit it. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, PayPal, right, would be in the middle, debiting and crediting. You don't actually send something peer-to-peer in the way that you do an email. Well, Bitcoin was an interesting invention because Bitcoin was the first software system where if you tap into the system, now you can literally, and sort of in air quotes, send this amount, and you're not copying it. It doesn't work the way your email works, and we don't need to get into the technicals of how it works, but just understand that you're transferring from your address to another address on this ledger, really directly on the ledger. And so now I can send my value and I'm not copying it. So there's no way to double spend it. I can't copy and just send it and just, so Bitcoin solved that problem.
Right. Now, am I right in a very simplistic way, again, the 6-year-old understanding that Bitcoin is both more secure and more dangerous for an individual than other means because you have your vault, you have your account, and only you can get into it. It's virtually unbreakable. Maybe perhaps it is unbreakable, but if you lose that, you're in trouble. That's my understanding. How far off am I?
Yeah, you're not far off. I think when you're talking intrinsically about how Bitcoin works, so if we're just dealing with the software directly, and I'm a participant, I have a wallet, maybe you just downloaded it, and I am controlling that wallet. No one can move your funds unless they have the private key that's associated with your wallet. So that private key is key, is essential to operating and transacting on the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, so that's and the issue about unbreakable in the sense of the Bitcoin blockchain has never been spoofed. There's a lot of interesting computer science, cryptography that sort of there's a mechanism of consensus that maintains that this is the ledger and that you can't counterfeit it. You can't counterfeit a Bitcoin. There's no counterfeit Bitcoin. Now, someone could create a new blockchain, but it's clear that it's not the Bitcoin and it's not your Bitcoin. So these are, it's really some computer science, a feat of computer science that's involved here. Now, on top of that, there are applications where maybe if it is too risky for you to have your own private key, there are companies that actually will do that for you. They'll really be the custodians of your Bitcoin, of your crypto, and that's a $1 billion business today.
So the other aspect of Bitcoin that has received some attention is the mining and the drain on the world's energy that creates. Talk through that a little bit. Why is it that in some regions of, I think even in the US and some countries, that a not insignificant percentage of energy consumption is Bitcoin mining?
Yes, and mining is the term that has stuck, even though it's a bit of a misnomer because it's no one is mining, but we use the term for the process of validating the transactions on this ledger. So again, this is computer science stuff, and basically the way if we talk about Bitcoin, the way that these transactions get confirmed is through a network of nodes, of computer nodes, and in a nutshell, in order to participate in this, you've got to burn a lot of computer power. So if you're one of the nodes, if you're running a node on the Bitcoin blockchain, your computer has to work, which means a lot of electricity has to be cooled down. So you have actual farms of hardware that are just running these calculations so that they can participate in this validation process of this ledger. And yeah, it's energy intensive. That said, I mean, I sort of have two opinions on this. I mean, there's this one opinion of, okay, because people will put out a figure of, it's, I don't know, the same amount of energy that's consumed in name your state or name your country. Which again, but to me raises the question: well, are we in the business of determining which use of energy is the most socially beneficial or not? I mean, we're going to just do that for everything because it's still going to be a long list. But then there are efforts within the crypto economy, and there are a lot of players. There are a lot of developments to minimize energy use, and actually come up with different types of consensus mechanisms that aren't as energy intensive.
So let's apply this to national security writ large.
Mm.
One of the things you've done in recent years is on Lawfare and elsewhere is take a look at the implications of the emerging cryptocurrency markets for various issues of national security. Just pick one or two. What do you think are some of the most interesting applications of this to national security and implications of it for national security that anyone involved in the discipline should be keeping their eye on?
Well, I would say that there are three buckets for how to look at national security risks around crypto. And, they may align with your time horizon, how you're looking at the risk. So the first is the short term activity that's happening now of bad actors simply using crypto to fund their activities, to fund their operations, or to steal crypto, or cyber criminals who are launching ransomware attacks, right, where they're locking up your hardware for you to pay in crypto in order to release the information, sort of blackmail via crypto. There's the terrorist crowdfunding example, but even more so than that, because maybe I should have buried the lead in terms of that crypto crowdfunding, because someone might be at home thinking, well, did they raise that
Right.
much money?
Yeah.
Like what
Yeah.
happened? At the time, they didn't raise that, but they raised about $600 worth of Bitcoin. At the time, in 2016 money, that money would be worth more now, but they only had a couple of transactions. But the thing is that's a very rudimentary use of this technology for ill. What may be more of a concern would be really just the laundering, sort of adding a new money laundering tool in the toolkit, right, for money launderers. Because when folks are laundering money, they're simply just trying to disguise funds and put it through different hops and through different forms and different institutions if they can. And now you have crypto, which means I can take maybe illicit cash and go to a Bitcoin ATM, which does exist. Those things exist, and put it into Bitcoin. Then I can send it to a drug supplier or whatnot. So now you've got a more complicated money laundering landscape. But the good side of this, or maybe the mitigating factor, is that a lot of this activity is visible, right? Because these crypto transactions can be seen. Now there's an industry of blockchain analytics.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
forensics, right? People are tracking
Mhm.
and finding stuff. So that's maybe the immediate concern. And a state like, let's say, North Korea has been involved with a lot of hacking of cryptocurrency exchanges. There's a second bucket, which I would say is the fact that crypto is so innovative the space is so innovative. This is the computer science world where there are a lot of innovations that maybe don't fit into the regulatory framework. Because that first bucket, how do you counter it? Well, you counter it the same way you counter it, you counter illicit finance happening in banks and at money service businesses, hawalas, etc. You sort of apply regulations. So when people use these services to get the money, you put them through a process where you have to know who they are. You have to check their ID. Right? That's just basic financial services anti-money laundering regulation. So that gets covered. That covers the first bucket. But the second bucket, without getting into too much detail, is that there are innovations that maybe don't fit into that. Like crypto is more of a decentralized ecosystem. So there's always this risk that the innovation may outpace the regulators and law enforcement. So that's happening. But the third issue, which is probably the thing I'm thinking a lot about now as a national security risk, is that because this innovation of crypto, this new way of dealing with finance that's more internet based, because it now exists, it now also exists for state actors to play in to find an alternative way to transfer money outside of the banking system and thus outside of the influence of the United States and US sanctions power. So we're really in the midst of, I would say, I think since 2018, we've been in the midst of quiet exploration of alternative, sometimes blockchain based payment systems that Iran is experimenting with. Russia is very much investing in and researching with the stated goal of circumventing U.S. sanctions, finding a way to do international trade where the U.S. can't, tell the bank, do not, block that transaction, block that account. So we're in this world where it may not necessarily be Bitcoin. It's not going to be Bitcoin per se that it would be the issue. The issue is that there's now exploration of alternative ways for doing global payments, and the U.S. How the U.S. either reacts to that, how the U.S. addresses it, that's sort of a big key question now.
Yeah, plenty of stuff to keep people in your former analytic positions busy. But it's not just an intelligence community issue. You've raised the AML and other issues. How well prepared, from your outside vantage point, how well prepared do you think the U.S. government is through entities like the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and others? Are we playing catch up to this system, or do you get the sense that we're on it and we are where we need to be, even as it evolves?
I will say I'm going to channel my former inner school teacher with the progress report, and I will say, for the first bucket of catching the bad guys, right? If I can use that term, catching the bad guys who are using crypto now, I would give us a good grade. I would give us a B plus, maybe A minus. Because you look at go to the DOJ, Department of Justice website, you're going to see all these busts of crypto, of ransomware, of even terrorist financing. I would say that the government knows what's going on, and it knows where the gaps are. And I deal a lot with folks at Treasury, folks at DOJ. Since 2016, the expertise has really grown on cryptocurrencies and on digital assets. There are now more tools that are available. So I would say we're doing well there. But the bucket of sort of innovation, how there's this sort of gray area, I'd say there we're sort of at a C minus, because the pace of innovation in the crypto space, it just outpaces what regulators have, what law enforcement have, and I'd say an intel too as well, just because of how quickly things move in crypto. So I would say that we're a C there. Now, failing grade, I don't know if I want to say failing, but this bigger question, because I wouldn't give us a failing grade, but I would say the question of what is the future of money and global payments, and will we have other different digital infrastructure? Will that grow, and who's going to lead that? China right now is, in the early stages of its own new central bank digital currency, and it's developing infrastructure, and it's trying to encourage the rest of the world to sort of learn from its model of digital finance. I don't think we're even in the ball game there yet, and I think that's where, maybe I'll say incomplete. I mean,
Yeah.
the Biden administration has last year in 2022 sort of put out a lot of, created an executive order to get
Mhm.
the interagency to focus on this more, but I think there's a long way to go.
It does feel incomplete to me. Now, again, I don't know who's working on this where, but for two reasons, I can perhaps in an amateur way assess that it's probably incomplete. One is that this is a kind of technology for currency, if you will, that didn't exist in its form 10 or 15 years ago. So a lot of the senior analysts in the US government who work on these issues didn't grow up with this. Therefore, they're learning it. They're not coming in as native experts who are then applying all of the tradecraft of analysis and the link analysis and the technology to it, but they're learning as they go. And then secondly, it's just not as wide in the cultural imagination. I can't think of a single movie or TV show that I've seen that had a heavy cryptocurrency focus that was compelling. And maybe it's out there and I've missed it, but I haven't seen something that's entered the popular discourse in a way that kind of creates that critical mass for people to be ahead of it because they've been thinking about it not just at work, but it's out there in the cultural imagination. Does that make sense?
It does. I would say you're right, and I would say there's an added factor too, which is that a lot of these issues, especially once you start to get to these more horizontal, these questions on the horizon, right? Of well, will the payment system change, and will blockchain become more important? These are sort of far off questions. I mean, even China's um, investment in its new central bank digital currency, like, this is several years of planning, and it's really far off into the future that they're sort of planning. And so I think within our government, I think within the US government, it's not seen as so much of an immediate issue. Especially when, if you think about it. So, I mean, here's a perfect example. So the issue of China's digital currency, they have a central bank digital currency. Now it is a popular issue. I mean, I've testified on the Hill on it, so it's not like, people on the Hill and other people aren't thinking about it. But what I will say is that there's this learning curve. It's like the first question that comes up, the national security question is, okay, is this going to displace the dollar, this new Chinese digital currency? Right? Because that's obviously that's a huge national security issue, right? If that were the case. And the short answer is no. In the next year or two, right? Because this does not change the fundamentals of the global economy or of China's economy and its the things that impact its regular currency. So I think when people hear that, they sort of take a sigh of relief and they think like, oh, okay, good. So I don't really need to worry about this. And my answer is no, you still need to care about it, because the plan of the People's Republic of China is a there's a long vision that they have for the global economy. The play is not to displace the US dollar by introducing this new digital currency. That's not the game that they're playing. The play is to introduce new technology that slowly they test out, that other countries hopefully will start to use, to then build an alternative payment system that may take 7, 10 years. It may take 10 years for,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so it's a very different, it's not an immediate concern, but it should be a priority in my mind.
So many of these things that we've talked about, both from your own career and in terms of the substance here. I mean, I'm talking counterterrorism. I'm talking overall financial intelligence work, link analysis, the cryptocurrencies. You've brought a lot of those into your newest creative project. And I want to talk about that a bit because it really is a remarkable audio experience so far. And we're talking about the Jabbari Lincoln Files, your, I don't know what to call it. It's a podcast, but it really is an audio narrative experience, a work of fiction. But it sure seems like there's quite a bit of Yaya Fanusie in Jabbari Lincoln. Talk about that. Why did you choose to do this fictional portrayal of some of these very issues we've been talking about, really focused around this character?
So the Jabbari Lincoln Files is a fictional audio narrative. It is, I'm calling it, it's a spy thriller, an audio spy thriller, but hopefully it's more immersive than an audiobook would be per se. And I wrote it, I'll tell you the roots of it actually were in a few years ago. I actually was considering, doing a bit of a memoir, and it's something that I had sort of floated. I had a proposal out there, and it's interesting. That's why sometimes rejection is the best. It's the best medicine, and it's often the best thing you can get, because like many an aspiring author who thinks that they've got a great story and they want to write a memoir, of course you think your story is the best, and so I didn't get too many bites initially for my own proposal. And that was the reason why I say that was good, is because it actually made me think about, well, what would actually be more interesting? I took a step back and I said, you know what? I've always been a creative person. Um, you know, it might actually be better to make up a story, to write a fictional story and have fun with it. And I remember, I think you and I think we met a couple years ago, pre-pandemic, and when I was sort of thinking about, maybe writing something fictional would be good, and so
Yeah.
that put me on the path. I don't know if you remember that coffee.
I remember it really well because I had read through your memoir as you'd written it, and it's fantastic. And I don't know how to say this appropriately. I was disgusted that the publication industry wasn't jumping on it, because it's remarkable. And then you said, you know what? I think it may work better as a work of fiction. I'm like, really? Because it's such a compelling story. I don't know if it needs that, except from that external spur of it's not happening at the pace you'd want it to, the way it is. And then as you described it to me, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'd totally read that or listen to that. And it's taken a while, but you're there. You've got the first episode is out as we're recording this. You've got a couple of other episodes that I've listened to that will be coming out. And just to give listeners here a sense of what the substance is, I'm going to play a clip now that talks a little bit about some of this financial link analysis work that you in the character of Jabbari Lincoln describe. Let's play that.
We had to uncover how criminals, corrupt politicians, and terrorists were devising new innovative technical ways to cover their financial tracks. You had to have an eye for uncovering patterns and links. For others, finding connections was either a chore of drudgery or a game of chance. The first connections most people find are often flimsy, usually nothing more than coincidental. But it was the job of a good intelligence analyst to sift those random coincidences and incidental contacts from the real connections and nefarious networks.
So as you describe what financial analysts do, including superstar analyst Jabbari Lincoln, did you have to think hard about how much you could include, and were you going to reveal any secrets of how the U.S. government actually is ahead of the private sector on this, or did you feel it was pretty much open field?
Well, the benefit of me writing this is that, like I explained with my career, it's interesting that I started as an intelligence analyst. Did economic stuff, but more political, and then I did the counterterrorism work. So I was familiar with the methodology that we're talking about here. But then it was when I left government that I sort of dug deeper into how you could do all of this through open source. Not all of this, but could do so much of this through open source. And much of what I draw on, in fact, I actually kind of make a point in some of the story to say how this database is open source. This information is publicly available. You'll hear that in the story. And so, much of what I'm drawing on is public and is open source, and I'm not necessarily relying on anything classified. And of course, everything has gone through the publications review board, but I actually I've actually enjoyed the fact that, I can sort of take things that I've seen the past 10 years, because I've been out of government the past 10 years, and write about that. And I'm not writing about anything that, that I did previously within the government. None of the, all of the examples that I'm touching on are things that, you could have learned about in the public space.
Right. I will encourage everyone to listen to the Jabbari Lincoln Files, but I'm going to preview just a little bit of it. First of all, you set it up initially, and it's not in the voice of Jabbari Lincoln to start. It's in the voice of someone we don't know, who's basically saying, you need to listen to what Jabbari Lincoln says in these files in order to figure out what has happened and how we got to this catastrophe, which it's implied there has been some global financial crisis or other kind of devastation that has occurred. So it's almost like this is a found footage kind of thing. That's such an interesting device to use. And so many producers, directors have tried to do that and have not done it well. And some have pulled it off. But it does make it a challenge for you as a storyteller in terms of the revelations and how to bring them out during the series. Why did you choose to go that direction, and how did you feel that was fun as the producer of this?
Well, some of it, like the creative process, often is trying to respond to a practical question and practical issues, right? And one of the problems I had in the story. So as I started to write the story, I'm writing it in the point of view of Jabbari Lincoln. So Jabbari Lincoln, it's not a pseudonym. I mean, this is a fully fleshed character. He's not me, but
Right.
the story is written from his perspective. Now, as I wrote the story, now there are many scenes where Jabbari Lincoln is not present. And so I actually had to think of, wait a second, if this isn't his point of view, now how could he be narrating when he's not there? And just from that, I said, you know what? We need another narrator. So that's how we came up with this idea of another person who's narrating the story and talking about the files outside of him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other part of it, in terms of the connection on to your experience, is that the series really starts off with Jabbari, who is a superstar, you could say. Now, he's not the superstar analyst on Russia who predicted Russia invading Ukraine, or the person who led the way to bin Laden. He's a very big fish in a small pond of illicit finance, but he is the guy who really sets the standard for that in the story. And yet the story begins and he's in a bad place. Let's listen in.
Jabbari, you have not been able to clear up the issues the Office of Security has raised, said the other, more senior agent, William Kreider. I realized he was the observing agent. This was no discussion amongst intelligence colleagues on the same side, but an interrogation, a typical FBI interrogation. One agent asking most of the questions, keeping my attention on him, while the other, mostly silent, observed my reactions and responses.
So Yaya, this is an interrogation scene, and you're kind of starting with Jabbari not as his superstar self. We hear a little bit about that and we figure it out as the series goes on, but you're starting with him in crisis mode right at the beginning. Obviously a little harsher than what, you described earlier for yourself, but you're pulling from some real emotion here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to describe it, right, is it is a fictional story with realistic elements. So when I'm drawing on things that may have happened, the elements that are there, elements that I may have known about, but placing them in a more dramatic, way to sort of drive the plot. And uh, the jumping off point, I think what I wanted to do was I wanted to, put the listener or the reader, because maybe this will be a book as well at some point, to put the listener in the shoes of someone who has sort of been whose feet have been knocked from under him, and so it's funny because that intro, which starts the story, at one point I thought, in my editing, I said, you don't really know who he is. Should I build this up better? And I had some people review it, and every time they said, no, I'm sold because it's so intense. And I think what I also wanted to do is there's this side of, one thing about the clearance process, or really the reinvestigation process that I think I can share. Maybe you relate, right? It's funny when you go through that, whether it's your initial clearance or reinvestigation, you know, there is that emotion. I know plenty of people who, when they did their initial clearance, some people talk about they were brought to tears going through that process. That's not a rare occurrence, but you don't get, I haven't really seen that in a movie or in a book. Maybe I've missed it. So I wanted to put something that was very real, very palpable. Yes, of course, it's sensationalized, and there's it's somewhat over the top, maybe, but it's also real in some ways, and I wanted to convey that.
Yeah, it is fiction, and it may be, and I wouldn't say over the top. It may be more dramatic than our experiences were, but it is drama. That is the point, right? It's not unrealistic in that. What's fascinating to me is the first episode that is out there for everybody. It's, I wouldn't say cerebral necessarily, but there is some, through that experience of the interrogation and no secret, Jabbari is put on administrative leave for some unresolved issues regarding some past activity. There's a lot of exposition to explain that within the telling of that narrative, but it really grounds you for the financial intelligence issues, number one, and for the person of Jabbari Lincoln. Episode 2, which I think will be out when we release this episode, I was blown away because suddenly we have an extended action scene that I would imagine when this does reach film and it's on screens, because I think it has that quality to it. This is going to be one of those scenes. I remember like the shootout scene in Heat, where it just went on forever, but you didn't feel like it went on forever. It was just artfully done. And that's the scene. I won't give away the details because it does give away where the story is going a bit. But you had to do something that I'm not sure you had done before, certainly at that length, which is write an extended physical action scene with a whole lot of movement and activity. How did you prepare yourself for that? That doesn't come naturally.
I don't know. I don't know if I prepared. I think it's just the creative imagination process, thinking of something. That the scene that you're talking about, it's a crucial part of the story. And it might be, if I can remember correctly, it actually might have been one of those situations. I don't know if this is bad, but it might have been one of those situations where I thought of the scene before the actual plot. I was thinking, oh wow, this would be great to have something like this happen, but hopefully it fits. It might have been that. Really,
you found a way that the story could have this scene in it, right? That's wonderful.
Yeah, maybe I should give away little tidbits here and there. The idea of taking stuff that's real. Like, for example, there's a part in that scene where you hear Jabbari, and he's talking about how something the overseas deployment people told him before his war zone deployment, which was, if you ever get caught, if you ever get kidnapped, fight like the Dickens to get away, because you're not gonna. So that's something very real, and so I put that in his mind as he's going through the experience, which I guess I gave away a little bit of it, but I think it'll still be good.
But we don't know the context, and if you want to hear the context, you'll have to listen to the Jabbari Lincoln Files. Yaya, where is that available for people to listen to?
So the Jabbari Lincoln Files is available wherever you can get your podcasts. So wherever you're getting this podcast, it should be, on Apple, Spotify, Audible, etc. Mm-hmm. So wherever you are. And I will say that this is, the subtitle is for this season is the Mansa Protocol. This, the intention is this is the first season. Ooh. So definitely would be, I think people will enjoy it.
I guarantee they will enjoy it based on the first few episodes that I have heard. Yeah. Looking back at the experience of creating this, kind of the creative process and what you've put into it, kind of what are your reflections that will be useful for you going forward?
Well, I think it's all about knowing what really drives you emotionally, creatively. And I'll share one thing, and I don't know if this will help other people in the audience. I don't know if other people will agree with this, but I found this for me. I remember a few years ago hearing someone say, I don't know who it was, but they said, when you're at the age of 14, that what you find that really interested you then is often linked to what you're good at or what you enjoy. And I remember hearing that. And obviously, I thought about it, I was like, what was I doing when I was 14? And for me, that was junior high, right? I think it was 14. Yeah. Yeah. And I was in junior high. And junior high, my pastime was I drew comics, or really comic strips. So I would draw these comic strips, and the comic strips were based on characters from my friends. So I would take my friend Nick, my friend Jay, and then I would make, one was, I had this, well, I had a friend named Aaron, and his character was Ramarin. He was a Rambo character, and
Wow.
he had this action. Then I had comedy strips, and these were black and white on notebook paper with like 6 blocks, etc. And I would come up with these series. Each series would have episodes, and I would hand it out to my friends every week or so. And I love that. I did it not for anything, but just wanting to do it for my friends. And so I thought about that. And I think for me, the Jabbari Lincoln Files is an extension of that, creating something that is, from my mind, reflecting the environment, but doing it in a way that I hope is enjoyable, intriguing for people. And I hope that people benefit from it.
You bet. Well, we are the beneficiaries of that, even if we don't get to see the comics. We're getting to see.
Those are the lost files, the lost archives.
The true lost files. That's season 2, right? Jabbari Lincoln, covert illustrator. We end each podcast here by reaching into our chatterbox with some pre-printed questions. So let's see what it has to offer for you today. Who is someone in your field or a related one whose work more people should be following? Your chance to give a shout out to someone who's working, and you define field however you want. It can be crypto, it can be financial intelligence more widely, or national security more widely, but who's someone whose work you are familiar with that you'd like to bump up a little bit here and recommend to people?
Wow. Well, I'm actually going to pivot from my national security work, and I'm going to mention someone who I've never met, but I feel like I should give credit where credit is due. I'm actually going to mention a mystery writer.
Oh.
A mystery writer named Jeffrey Deaver. And in terms of his most mainstream work, people may know in the 90s there was a movie with Denzel actually called The Bone Collector. It was with Denzel and with Angelina Jolie. But that was based off of his book. And I will say one thing, and I guess I'm giving something away by saying this. That story, that book, the character's name of the detective, it's a detective series, is Lincoln Rhymes.
Whoa. I think I'm picking up on this.
So,
I'm slow, but I'm not that slow.
Yeah. So the Lincoln Rhyme series was a series that I read while I was a teacher, actually. So in the early 2000s, I really enjoyed his writing because he really, I think I sort of patterned myself off of this in many ways, because he teaches you so much about the subject as he's taking you through the mystery, right? An area, and even the non-Lincoln Rhyme novels, he sort of really explains something very technical, and you feel like you can absorb it. And I think that has impacted some of my writing. So I'll say Jeffrey Deaver. I think he's still writing novels. Someone to check out.
A great choice. Yaya, we appreciate you coming on Chatter and sharing your stories with us.
Thank you, David. Anytime. I appreciate it.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.